He was mopping the floor of the 38th floor conference room when she walked in. Not the CEO version of her. Not the woman whose photograph hung in the lobby downstairs. This version had her jacket off and her eyes on something nobody else in the room could see. He kept mopping. She didn't look through him. She looked at him 1 second, maybe 2. Then she looked away. He didn't know it then. He couldn't have known it. But she had already made a decision. And that decision was about to change everything for both of them. Somewhere in this building, a clock was running. 89 days. A deadline written into a dead man's will. A company worth hundreds of millions. A name being passed from one hand to another. And in the middle of all of it, a man with a mop. Who said no when everyone else said yes. Who walked away when the money doubled. Who showed up anyway. The alarm didn't ring that morning. James Holt woke up anyway. 4:53. Same as every day. His body had stopped needing the alarm somewhere around month 3 of this job, which said something about a man, though he wasn't entirely sure what. He lay on the sofa for exactly 45 seconds. Not because he needed to. Because the apartment was 17 steps from end to end, and he'd learned to measure everything in this life by what it cost him to cross it. The sofa cushion had a permanent indent now where his shoulder pressed in every night. His father's armchair had one too. Different shape. Same story. He sat up. The city outside the window was still deciding whether it wanted to be dark or light. Atlanta in October did that. Took its time. Committed to nothing before 6 a.m. He pulled on his uniform in the dark, navy blue. His name wasn't on it. Just a logo and a number. He'd thought about that on day 1, then stopped thinking about it, which was probably the smarter move. The coffee maker was set on a timer. Robert had done it last night before bed. That was the thing about his father that nobody outside this apartment ever saw. The man's hand shook now, some mornings worse than others. But he still set the coffee timer every single night, 12 hours in advance, with the focused precision of a man who needed to keep doing the things he had always done. James watched the pot fill without saying anything about it. He poured 2 cups, drank his standing at the counter, left the second on the kitchen table where his father would find it. He was pulling on his jacket when his phone rang. 4:58 a.m. Laura's name on the screen. His chest didn't tighten anymore when she called at odd hours. It had the first dozen times. Now it just did a small, quiet thing he couldn't name. Something between bracing and accepting. Hey. Her voice was thin but not scared. I can't sleep again. Same dream, no dream. Just awake. My side hurts a little, and I didn't want to take anything because I wasn't sure if it was the kind of hurt that means something, or the kind that's just. Laura. I know. You're going to say call the nurse line. You should call the nurse line. I hate the hold music. He almost smiled. Almost, what's it like tonight? A 4 maybe. It's fine. She stopped. He heard her shift in her bed. I just wanted to hear someone's voice that wasn't a television. So he talked. He told her about the weird water stain on the wall of the 4th floor break room that had spread another 2 inches since Monday. Would you treat them with kindness? He told her about the night security guard George Owens who'd started bringing crossword puzzles to his desk and asking James to help with the 7-letter words. He kept his voice low so Robert wouldn't wake. He talked until her breathing slowed, and the gaps between her responses stretched out, and finally she said, soft and drowsy, "You can go now. I'm okay, I'll call you on my break. You don't have to." I know. He hung up, stewed in the kitchen for a moment, then picked up his jacket and left. 40 minutes on 2 buses and a walk that turned his ears red in the October chill. He'd done the math once on what an Uber would cost him every day. Done it once. Never again. The buses gave him time. He used it the same way every morning. Phone out. Working through the project management modules he'd downloaded 3 months ago, paying $12 a month for access to a certification program he did 20 minutes at a time in transit. The woman who sat across from him on the second bus had started giving him a look of mild approval somewhere around week 2. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Russell Holdings occupied the top 18 floors of a glass tower on Peachtree Street that reflected the sunrise like it was doing the city a favor. James came in through the loading entrance at the back, signed his name on the sheet at the desk where George was finishing the overnight, and pulled his cart from the storage room. 7-letter word, George said without looking up from his puzzle. Starts with D, means stubborn. James didn't break stride, dogged. That's 6. Dig deep. George frowned at his paper. James pushed his cart to the elevator. The executive floors were his first rotation, 23rd through 26th. He knew these hallways the way he knew the apartment in Decatur. Every scuff on the baseboard, every conference room that held heat and which one stayed cold, no matter what anyone did to the thermostat. He moved through them the way water moves through a familiar channel. No wasted motion. That Tuesday felt the same as every other Tuesday for exactly 47 minutes. Then it didn't. He was working the 24th floor corridor, the long stretch outside the main conference suite, when he heard the voices through the partially open door. Not unusual. Lawyers liked conference rooms the way plants liked windows. But the volume was different this morning. Not raised exactly. Pressed. Like something being held together by considerable effort. He kept moving. He wasn't trying to listen. He had a job that required a specific kind of invisibility, and he'd gotten good at it. Not the invisibility of insignificance, though people tried to put that on him. The invisibility of discipline, of staying in your lane at the speed required. But the voice that reached him next was different from the lawyer's. Younger. Precise. Every word placed exactly where she meant it. I understand the timeline, Thomas. I've understood the timeline for 6 months. What I need is a solution, not a restatement of the problem. And then a second voice, older, carefully neutral. The clause is what it is, Sarah. Harold was thorough. Harold was 81, and thought stubbornness was a virtue. He also built a 9-figure company from a single parcel of land in 1971. So, I know what he built. I've been running it for 4 years. James had reached the end of the corridor. He turned the corner, and whatever had been said next in that room, he didn't hear it. He filed it away in the part of his brain where irrelevant information went. That part was substantial. It did not stay irrelevant for long. His 11 o'clock rotation took him back to the 24th floor to collect the break room waste bins. He came around the corner from the north stairwell. At the same moment, someone else came around the corner from the south stairwell, and the near collision was avoided by about 4 inches and fast reflexes on both sides. She stepped back. He stepped back. He registered several things in quick succession. The quality of the suit. The deliberate way she stood even after being startled. Shoulders back, feet planted, like her default setting was composed. The fact that she'd come from the stairwell at 11 on a Tuesday morning, which meant either the elevators were down or she was avoiding someone. He'd checked the elevators himself at 9. They were fine, he said. The elevator on the right side of the lobby is working if you need it. She looked at him. Not through him. Not past him. At him. There was a difference. He noticed it because it was rare on this floor. I know, she said. Most people who take the stairs at this hour do it because the elevator's down, or they're trying not to run into someone. She studied him for a moment, like she was deciding something. How long have you worked here? Almost 2 years. Name? James. She nodded once. Then she walked toward the elevator. At the intersection of the corridor, she paused, and he was already moving again. But he felt the pause the way you feel someone watching you. He didn't look back. Her name was Sarah Russell. He knew that much. Everybody in the building knew that much. CEO 32, granddaughter of Harold Russell, who'd built the company and apparently had opinions about her personal life, reaching from beyond the grave. He'd seen her photograph in the lobby display twice, the kind of corporate headshot that the PR people spent too much money on. She looked different in person, less composed in the deliberate way photographs were composed. More composed in the way actual people were, which was messier and more convincing. He mentioned none of this to George when he passed the security desk at noon. George didn't look up. 10-letter word. Means unavoidable. Inevitable. You eat yet? I'll eat at 1. Your father called the desk phone. Ask me to tell you Laura's nurse called her back and she's fine. James stopped. The weight that had been sitting in his chest since 4:58 that morning shifted slightly. Not gone. Just redistributed. Thanks, George. Go eat something. You look like a man having a complicated Tuesday. He ate in the break room on the 14th floor, which was the least used break room in the building and therefore reliably quiet. Sandwich from home. Coffee from the machine that nobody had cleaned properly since March. He read 14 pages of project management theory about stakeholder communication and thought about the water stain on the 4th floor wall, which had now spread in a pattern that suggested the pipe behind it was losing the argument with time. His afternoon rotation was the west side of the 22nd floor. Would you treat them with kindness? Which included the row of smaller conference rooms used for overflow meetings and what the building manager called informal executive gatherings, which meant meetings people didn't want recorded in the official calendar. He was working his way down the corridor with the cleaning cart, the hallway quiet, the afternoon light coming flat through the frosted glass panels, when he heard it. A voice he recognized by its precision, not heard clearly, just enough to follow. He was 6 feet from a conference room door that had been pulled to but not latched, the way doors sometimes swung back from a hard close. He wasn't standing still. He was moving. But sound carries in quiet corridors, and this was a voice he'd filed away that morning, and his brain, apparently, had not finished with it. She's not going to find anyone. Not in the financial sector. Not with the conditions Harold built into that clause. Any man who knows the family knows what signing that means. You're asking someone to tie themselves to 2 years of scrutiny. A pause. 89 days, Marcus. We just have to be patient. He was past the door before the sentence ended. He didn't slow down. He didn't look. He didn't file this in the irrelevant section this time, because something about the word patient, said in that particular tone of careful satisfaction, didn't go there. It went somewhere else. The section where he put things that needed thinking about later. The name Russell. The clause. 89 days. He was at the end of the corridor pushing his cart into the service alcove when it connected. Not all of it. Just enough to make him stand there for a moment with his hand on the cart handle, looking at the wall. The woman from the stairwell this morning was Sarah Russell. Sarah Russell was the CEO, and someone was counting days and calling it patience. He didn't know what he was going to do with that information. He went back to work. She came to the supply room at 4:47, which was 13 minutes before his shift ended. He was logging his cart inventory on the sheet by the door. He heard the click of heels in the corridor that didn't match the usual cadence of anyone who worked this floor, and he turned, and she was standing in the doorway. Not like she'd happened by, like she'd looked up where to find him and then come there. He waited. I need to talk to you, she said. I'm finishing my shift. I know. I'll pay you for your time past. I don't sell time after my shift. She stopped. A very brief recalibration. The kind that happened when someone said something a person in her position didn't often hear. I'm sorry, she said. That came out badly. Do you have 10 minutes? Not with me as your employer. As someone who needs to talk. He considered her for a moment. The quality of the request. The specific way she'd corrected herself. Most people in this building issued corrections as a performance. Hers had the particular texture of being actually sorry. 10 minutes, he said. They went to the cafeteria on the first floor. She would have taken him somewhere expensive. He saw that in the pause when he pushed the glass door open and gestured inside, the half-second where her instinct and his choice met, and she adjusted without comment. She ordered coffee. He ordered the same. She didn't order food. Neither did he, though not for the same reason. He let her talk. She was precise and didn't waste words, and he appreciated that about her, without telling her so. She laid out the structure of the problem the way someone who had spent 4 years running a company laid things out. Her grandfather Harold had built the clause into his will 6 years ago. She had to be married before her 33rd birthday. Not engaged. Not living with someone. Married. And the marriage had to last 2 years from the date of the ceremony, with evidence of what Harold's lawyers had called genuine shared domestic commitment. If she didn't satisfy the clause, 51% controlling interest transferred to her cousin Eric Cole. She said the number of days remaining. 89. Said it the way you say a thing that is both exact and insufficient. Why not someone you know? James asked. You must know people. I do know people. Something crossed her face, not quite bitterness. More like the end result of having been right too many times about something you wished you'd been wrong about. The problem is knowing people. The problem is that every person in my professional circle has something they need from Russell Holdings. Or they know Eric, which in several cases turned out to be the same thing. So you decided a janitor would be safer. She didn't flinch. That's not how I'd phrase it. How would you phrase it? You don't have a stake in this building's ownership structure. She paused. You also told me this morning that you weren't going to pretend I'd come from the stairwell for any reason other than the one I had. I haven't had a conversation like that in. She stopped. A while. He looked at his coffee, then at her. What's the offer? $500,000. $150,000 within 48 hours of the ceremony. The remaining $350,000 at the end of 2 years. Your private life remains yours. We appear together when necessary. We file jointly for tax purposes. At the end of 2 years, we dissolve the marriage. Cleanly. No claims. The number landed in him the way large numbers did when you'd been counting small ones for a long time. It didn't feel abstract. It felt immediate, and it felt like it had a face, and that face was Laura's. He did not show this. Why me? He asked. Not the version of why that was fishing for a compliment. The real version. She looked at him for a moment. The cafeteria hummed around them. Someone dropped a tray near the hot food station. When you stopped me in the corridor this morning, she said, your first instinct wasn't to apologize or defer or ask me if I needed anything. You gave me useful information. Without performing it. Without wanting something back for it. She set her coffee cup down. Everyone I've met in the last 3 months has wanted something before I finished my second sentence. You waited. I didn't know who you were. I know. That's exactly it. He thought about this. Not the flattery of it, because it wasn't flattery, it was observation. The difference mattered. Give me 3 days. That's fine. He pushed his chair back, then stopped. Have you looked into me at all? Not yet. Do it. All of it. And then decide if you still want to make this offer. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'll give you my answer in 3 days. He walked out of the cafeteria without looking back, through the lobby, through the rear entrance, into the October air that had made up its mind toward cold somewhere during the last hour. He walked to the bus stop and stood with his hands in his pockets and did not think about the number until the bus came. And then he let himself think about it for exactly the length of the ride home. $40,000. That was what Laura needed before she could be prioritized on the transplant list. That was the specific gap between where she was and where she needed to be. He'd done the math 17 different ways over the last 4 months. Had talked to social workers and hospital billing offices and 3 different charitable assistance programs. Had filled out more forms than he knew existed. The gap remained. $40,000. And that was only the first number. 500,000 had several names. It had Laura's name first. It had his father's name. It had the name of the supplemental insurance that Robert's fixed income barely touched. It had the name of the certification program he was doing 20 minutes at a time on the bus, which would be better done in concentrated hours with actual course materials. It had other names he hadn't let himself say out loud, yet, because he'd learned early that naming things you couldn't have made them cost twice. He got off the bus at his stop and walked the 4 blocks home. Robert was in his armchair when James came in, the radio on low, the lamp making a warm circle around the chair. The apartment smelled like something with onions. His father had cooked then. His hands were having a better day. James hung up his jacket, sat on the sofa across from his father, and told him everything. Not the abbreviated version. Not the edited one. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd decided during the bus ride that if he was going to sit with this for 3 days, he needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it correctly, and there was only one person in his life who qualified. Robert listened without interrupting. That was a skill James had never fully appreciated until he'd spent enough time in the world with people who couldn't do it. His father looked at a spot on the rug between them while James talked, and when James finished, the room was quiet except for the radio. Then Robert said, "Harold Russell. You know him?" Knew of him. Worked for a subcontractor on his second building. 1971. He shifted in his chair, the slow, careful movement of a man whose body required deliberation now. He came down to the site the week we were finishing the flooring. Just walked through. Not in a suit. Work pants and a jacket. Watched us work. At the end he shook every hand in the room before he left. Foreman, finishers, the two of us running the sander. He paused. He paid what he said he'd pay, and he paid it when he said he would. That was before I had any reason to track that kind of thing. But it stays with you. This is his granddaughter. I understand that. Robert looked up. His eyes at 62 had the quality of still water, difficult to disturb. I don't know what kind of person she is, but people tend to come from the ones who raised them more than from the ones who just gave them money. What did she seem like? Honest, James said. In the way that costs something. Not the easy kind. Did she ask you to decide on the spot? She gave me 3 days. His father nodded slowly. Then take 3 days and think clearly. Don't think about the number first. Think about it last. James didn't sleep much that night. He wasn't restless. He was just awake the way you're awake when you're working through something that deserves the effort. He lay on the sofa and ran the problem from several angles. Not the financial angle. He'd already been honest with himself about that one and its pull. The other angles. What was being asked. What it would require. What it would mean for the people in his life who hadn't been asked and whose lives would be shaped by the answer. He fell asleep somewhere after 2. The next morning he went to the hospital. Laura's room was on the 3rd floor, east wing, facing a courtyard that had a single tree that was spending October going spectacularly orange. She had positioned her laptop to see both the screen and the tree, which was very Laura. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said without looking up from whatever she was designing. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning. You look like you didn't sleep. Sit down. You're hovering." He sat in the chair by the window. The tree outside was doing its best. "How's your side?" "Better. The nurse was right. It was nothing. 3 on the scale maybe. I'm fine." She looked up then. She had their father's eyes, that same still quality, though in her case it sat over something more volatile. Something happened. Work. Is this the kind of work thing where you tell me, or the kind where you tell me you can't tell me? The second kind. For now. She looked at him for a long moment. Laura was 28 and had been dealing with her diagnosis for 4 years and had developed, in that time, a sharp economy of attention. She didn't spend it on things that weren't worth it. She was spending it on him right now, which meant she'd decided it was worth it. "Are you okay?" "I'm thinking through something." "I'm okay." "Does it involve Dad?" "It involves all of us. In the abstract. I'll tell you what I can when I can." She nodded once, the way their father did, and went back to her laptop. He sat with her for 2 hours, reading through his project management modules while she worked, and neither of them said very much, and it was exactly what he needed. That afternoon Sarah's investigator had finished. He knew because at 2:17 she sent him a text. 1 sentence. "I've looked. My offer stands." He sat with that for a while. He called her at 3. Said he had conditions. She said she was listening. They met after work at a diner near the hospital. Not where he'd told her to meet him. He'd chosen the location because he wanted a specific thing on his mind when he laid down his terms, and that tree in Laura's courtyard, going orange in the October light, was the thing. He picked the booth by the window that faced east. She was already there when he arrived. She was wearing different clothes than the office. Still pressed. Still precise. Would you treat them with kindness? But the jacket was off, and she was drinking water and looking at a notebook, and there was something in the quality of her attention in the unguarded moment before she saw him that he catalogued and filed. He sat down. He went through the 4 conditions. No notes. He'd thought them through carefully enough not to need any. His father, Robert, would know the truth. The actual truth. He didn't lie to his father. That was non-negotiable, and not going to be explained further. Laura would not know. Not because he was protecting her from the concept, but because she already carried enough weight. Would you treat them with kindness? And the last thing she needed was to understand that her brother's marriage had her name on it. She'd spend the 2 years convinced she'd ruined his life, and he wasn't interested in her spending energy on guilt when she needed all of it for other things. If the arrangement, at any point, caused direct harm to Robert or Laura, he would exit. No notice required. Whatever financial arrangement they'd formalized would be handled afterward. This was not a threat. It was simply what was true. The fourth condition took him a moment to phrase. He wanted to phrase it correctly, because it mattered and because she deserved to understand what he meant. You can't use me as a prop. Not in the way where you're talking to someone important and I'm standing next to you not quite being spoken to. I've been invisible in professional settings before, because of what I do for work, and I made my peace with it as a feature of the job. If I'm your husband, that's a different category. I'll stand in any room you need me in. But I'll be standing there as a person, not as scenery. She had been listening the whole time without interrupting. This was also rare. He appreciated it without telling her. All four, she said. You don't want to think about them? I've been thinking about most of them since this morning. She folded her hands on the table. The fourth one especially. I know what I was implying when I suggested the arrangement. The word I used in my head was safe. And I know that's a word I need to be more careful with. It's an honest word for what you meant. It's an honest word that contains something dishonest. A man who works with his hands for a living isn't less likely to be scheming. He's more likely to have less access to whatever I'm trying to protect. That's a different thing. He looked at her. That's a more honest version. Yes, I appreciate it. I want a lawyer for you, she said. Thomas Walsh is the family attorney. He'll represent the agreement, and he's thorough, and I trust him to be fair. But I want you to have someone who represents your interests specifically. I'll cover the cost. I'll find my own lawyer. That's more expensive. I'm aware. I'll find my own. Something shifted in her expression. Not disapproval. The opposite. One more thing, he said. She waited. He looked out the window. The hospital building was visible over the top of the parking structure across the street. He'd picked this table on purpose, and she hadn't asked why, and he realized suddenly that she'd seen him look at it when he sat down, and she'd waited to see if he'd explain, and when he didn't, she'd let it go. When I walk out of here tonight, he said, I'm going to be certain about what I'm agreeing to and why I'm agreeing to it. Both parts need to be true. I know why. I need to sit with the what for one more day. You have 3 days total. You've used 2. I've used the time I needed. I'll call you tomorrow morning. He left a 5 on the table for the coffee and walked out into the evening. He thought about his father on the walk home. About the specific quality of Robert Holt at a work site in 1971. 22 years old, running a floor sander, shaking the hand of a man who'd come down from wherever he'd been to look at the people doing the work. His father had been someone other than the man James knew once. Had been building things with hands that moved exactly the way he intended them to. Had believed, probably without thinking about it, that the work would compound. That doing the job well was its own form of argument for a certain kind of future. The Parkinson had started 6 years ago. The same year Harold Russell had written the clause into his will from his own position of certainty about other people's lives. It was funny, in the way things were sometimes funny when they weren't actually. The next morning he called her at 7:45. Yes, he said. A brief pause. Okay, I need to meet your family attorney this week. Not as a courtesy. I want to read everything. I'll arrange it for Thursday. And I want to bring my father to meet you before the wedding. Not as a performance. He'd want to know who you are. Another pause. Different texture than the first. Of course. I'll figure out my own lawyer. I know. He hung up and sat on the sofa for a moment in the quiet apartment. Would you treat them with kindness? The coffee his father had set the night before was still warm. He poured a cup and stood at the counter and thought about $500,000 and everything it was going to mean and everything it was going to cost that no contract would ever be able to measure. Then he put the cup in the sink and went to find his jacket. Thomas Walsh was exactly the kind of lawyer who had been doing this particular kind of work long enough to do it without ceremony. 65. Silver-haired, methodical, in the way that read as slow until you realized he'd already seen 3 angles you hadn't identified yet. He spread the contract documents across the conference table and went through them with James over the course of 3.5 hours. James asked 22 questions. He knew it was 22 because Thomas wrote each one down and numbered them. When they were finished, Thomas closed the folder and looked at him for a moment. You read carefully. I read everything I sign. That puts you ahead of a significant portion of the people I work with, including people whose job is to read documents. James looked at the stack of papers. Is there anything in here that's unfair to me? Thomas considered. The clause about public appearances could be more specifically defined. I've noted it. The exit provision in the case of material breach is somewhat weighted towards Sarah's interests. I've noted that as well. These are negotiable. What would you recommend? I'd recommend what I've noted. Whether she agrees to the modifications is the next step. She agreed to both modifications within 4 hours of receiving Thomas's notes. James was informed by text. He showed the text to his own attorney. The following morning, a woman named Patricia Carver, who had an office above a dry cleaning shop 2 miles from the apartment, and who had been referred to him by a paralegal he knew from a community development meeting 3 years ago. Patricia was 38 and sharp, and had the particular quality of someone who'd built something solid with insufficient materials. He trusted her in 40 minutes. She's not trying to take advantage of you, Patricia said, reviewing the amended documents. I know. But knowing and having it in writing are different things. I know that, too. She made 2 additional modifications of her own. Sarah's attorney agreed to both. The signing took 20 minutes. The conversation before it took considerably longer. He brought his father on a Friday evening. Would you treat them with kindness? Sarah opened the door of the Decatur address he'd given and stood aside, and Robert Holt walked into her world for the first time and looked at it the way he looked at all rooms, which was with the eyes of a man who'd built things and knew what held and what didn't. She had not dressed up. He noticed that. Not down either. Herself. There was a difference. She asked Robert if he wanted coffee, and he said yes, and she made it at the counter, while James and his father sat at the small kitchen table, and something about the fact that she stood at the counter and made it herself, rather than gesturing at the machine, seemed to settle something in Robert that James hadn't been certain could be settled. Robert asked her one question all evening that wasn't simple logistics or pleasantry. Have you ever done something for yourself? Not paid someone to do it for you? She set down her coffee, thought about it genuinely. I cook. Not well, but I cook. He nodded, like this was useful data. Daniel cooked when he was 12 because your mother. He caught himself. Old habit. The wrong son. James cooked when he was 12. Not well either. But he did it. I told him that the doing of it was the point. The quality comes later. She looked at Robert. Did it? Enough. When she walked them to the door, Robert shook her hand. 2 hands. The way he shook hands for things that mattered. She held the handshake without making a production of it. In the car on the way home, his father looked out the window. She sat for 90 minutes, he said, and didn't look at her phone once. She was being polite. No. People who are being polite still look. They feel the pull and they check themselves and then they look anyway. She didn't feel the pull. He watched the Atlanta streetlights. She was actually listening. The courthouse on a Wednesday morning smelled like industrial cleaning products and recycled air, which was, James thought, something of an occupational irony. He wore the gray suit, the only one. He'd had it cleaned and pressed and it looked what it was, which was a good suit purchased once for a bad occasion and kept carefully since. Thomas Walsh was there. Nicole Simmons, Sarah's attorney and close friend, dark red hair, and an expression of careful professional neutrality that kept shifting when she thought no one was looking. George had asked James that morning for an 11-letter word, and James had said industrious, and George had said that was 9, and James had said he was pretty sure, and George had said, go get married. Stop counting letters. Sarah was in the hallway when he came around the corner from the clerk's office. She was wearing white, not a wedding dress. A dress that happened to be white, clean-lined, the kind of dress that required the person wearing it to hold it rather than it holding them. She was holding it. He stopped. He'd been prepared for competent, for professional, for the version of her he'd been interacting with, across conference tables and contract negotiations. He was not entirely prepared for this specific version, which was still competent and professional, and also something else he didn't have an exact word for. You look? He started and then recalibrated mid-sentence because what he'd been going to say was too much for the moment and they both knew what this was. You look like yourself.
She glanced at him.
Is that good? Yes, the ceremony took 11 minutes. The clerk was efficient and warm in the way of someone who'd done this enough times to understand what it actually was, which was not the thing people performed in large venues but the thing itself, small and permanent. They had agreed on a handshake at the end. He'd suggested it. She'd agreed, without hesitation. Then the clerk asked them to sign, and Sarah's pen didn't work. She shook it, clicked it. Nothing. He reached into the inside breast pocket of the gray suit and produced a pen. Wooden, his father's work, the grain worn smooth from years of handling. He'd put it there this morning, when Robert had handed it to him in the apartment doorway without a word, just pressed it into his palm and held his gaze for a moment before turning back inside. My father made it, he said quietly. Sarah looked at the pen for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she signed. Handed it back with both hands, the way people hand back things that belong to a category they understand. He signed where the clerk indicated. Thomas Walsh took a photograph on his phone, because someone should. In the photograph, James is not smiling. He is looking at the space where Sarah's signature is drying on the paper, and his right hand is holding his father's pen, and his face has the quality of a man who has just done something that cannot be undone, and has decided this is acceptable. He didn't know that night, in the apartment back in Decatur, lying on the sofa with the ceiling above him, and the city going quiet outside, that the photograph would matter later. He didn't know that the pen in his jacket pocket would matter later. He wasn't thinking about later. He was thinking about the text message, waiting on his phone from a number he didn't have saved. He'd seen it when he changed out of the suit an hour after the ceremony, had read it twice, set the phone face down on the kitchen table, made dinner for his father, sat with Robert through the evening news, and now he was on the sofa in the dark, and the message was still there. I know what she offered you. I'll pay double to walk away. No name. He didn't need one. He picked up the phone, read it a third time, thought about the voice he'd heard through a not quite latched door 3 weeks ago, the word patient said in that particular tone, and now this. People offered double when they were afraid of what they'd lose at single. He put the phone on the cushion next to him, thought about his father's handshake at the courthouse, 2 hands for things that matter, thought about the pen. He turned off the phone and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and somewhere in that looking he understood that whatever he'd thought he was agreeing to 3 weeks ago in a supply room at the end of a shift had already become something else. Not larger, not smaller, just different. The specific kind of different that comes when you realize the frame you put around something is too small for what you're actually looking at. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He was going to need more than 3 days to figure it out. He didn't respond to the text message. Not that night. Not the morning after. He deleted it on day 3, which was also the first day he showed up at Russell Holdings not as an employee but as something the building's ID system didn't have a category for yet. The badge they gave him was a visitor pass, laminated. His name printed in the font they used for contractors and delivery people. He clipped it to his jacket pocket and rode the elevator to the 23rd floor and stood in the corridor outside Sarah's office for 4 seconds, before deciding that standing in corridors outside offices was something he'd done enough of from the other direction, and he was going to have to find a new relationship with this building entirely. Sarah's assistant, a young man named Paul, who moved through the office with the focused anxiety of someone perpetually 90 seconds behind schedule, looked up when James appeared at the desk, looked at the visitor badge, looked at James, processed something internally that took longer than it should have. Mr. Holt, she's expecting you. Go in. The office was large in the way of offices that were supposed to communicate something. Floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides, Atlanta spreading out in every direction below. The kind of view that was meant to remind you where you stood in relation to everything else. Would you treat them with kindness? Sarah was at her desk with 3 documents open and her jacket draped over the back of her chair, and she looked up when he came in with the focused attention of someone who'd been working since before the building opened. How's your father this morning? Good days vary. Yesterday was good. Good. She closed one of the documents. I need to talk to you about something before we discuss anything else. He sat down across from her, uninvited but also not wrong, and they both understood that. She told him about the consulting offer. Theodore Barnes had called her that morning. The Riverside Project. Barnes wanted someone with James's specific combination of on-the-ground construction knowledge and what Barnes had called apparently an instinct for what people actually need from a building versus what looks good in a prospectus. He wanted James attached to the project in an advisory capacity. Paid, Sarah added. A day rate. Kenneth worked out the number with Thomas. What's the number? She told him. It was a real number, not charity dressed in professional language. The kind of number that said Kenneth Barnes had done the math on what the knowledge was worth and paid it. James looked at the window. Atlanta below was going about its Tuesday. Independent, he said. Not through Russell Holdings, I assumed you'd say that. Kenneth will contract directly with you. Tell him yes, she nodded, made a note, then looked up. There's something else. He waited. I want to tell you something about why I made the choice I made. About your last job. About Eric's project. She folded her hands on the desk, not the power gesture. The honest one, which was smaller. I knew before I offered you anything. Nicole had the file within 6 hours of the morning I first saw you. I didn't tell you because I was concerned you'd say yes for the wrong reason. The office was very quiet. And now you're telling me. Because it's been 2 weeks, and I've been waiting for the right moment, and I've concluded there isn't one. There's just the telling. He considered her. The specific quality of her discomfort, which was the discomfort of someone who knew they'd been careful in a way that shaded into something else, and had decided to name it anyway. What did the file say exactly? You refused to sign a structural completion certificate on a parking structure. The subframe inspection had flagged a lateral load issue. The general contractor's site manager told you it was within acceptable variance. You told him it wasn't and that you wouldn't certify it. Eric knew, because the general contractor's site manager reported the delay to him. Eric pulled Russell Holdings' subcontracting agreement with your employer the following week. Project restructuring, officially. James said nothing for a moment. Then, the parking structure. Is it still standing? Yes, they redid the subframe 6 months later after another inspector flagged the same issue. Officially unrelated to your report, which was never formally filed because your employer declined to submit it. But it got fixed. It got fixed. He breathed out slowly. Not relief exactly. The specific exhale of someone who had carried an unanswered question for 3 years and was now putting it down. I want you to understand something, he said. I wasn't going to agree to this arrangement to get back at Eric Cole. That's not how I work. I know that. I've known that since I read the file. It's part of why I made the offer. But you still should have told me. Yes. No qualification. No extension of the sentence to soften it. I should have. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. I'll call Kenneth Barnes this afternoon. James. He stopped. Are you going to be able to work with this? The arrangement. What I just told you. He thought about it honestly. Not the version of honesty that came quickly because it was easy. The other kind. I'm already working with it, he said. I just needed you to know that I know. He walked out. The elevator on the way downs was empty. He rode it to the lobby and stood in the building's atrium for a moment, looking up through the glass at the floors stacked above him. Somewhere up them with kindness. Somewhere up there was the corridor where he'd spent 2 years pushing a cart through the same 40 feet of carpet. Somewhere above that was the conference room where he'd heard Eric's voice saying patient, Somewhere above that was Sarah Russell working through documents with her jacket off, and her full attention on whatever she was deciding. He walked out into the Tuesday. Kenneth Barnes's office was in Buckhead, 20 minutes north. James called on his way to the bus stop, and Barnes answered himself, which was a choice that communicated something about the man. Mr. Holt, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner about the 3 failure points in commercial permitting. I pulled the Riverside file this morning and the delay is exactly where you predicted. Which point? Environmental assessment. Third-party reviewer is backed up 8 weeks. There's a pathway around that if you've already done preliminary site work within the last 18 months. Independent certification through the state office instead of county. Takes 4 weeks. Costs more upfront. A pause. The specific pause of someone doing arithmetic. How much more? Call the state office and ask. The number's on their website. When you have it, compare it against what 8 weeks of carrying costs on a $340 million project looks like. Another pause. Shorter. When can you start? Give me a week to sort the contract with Thomas Walsh. Done. Barnes sounded like a man who'd spent 40 years recognizing when a conversation was over. Sarah's a good woman. I've known her since she was 7 years old, coming to Harold's site visits. I'm glad she's got someone who pays attention. James didn't know what to do with that sentence, so he filed it next to the other things he wasn't sure what to do with and said goodbye professionally. The contract with Kenneth was signed by Friday. Patricia Carver reviewed it in 40 minutes and made one amendment that Barnes accepted without pushback, which told James the rate was fair and the terms were clean. He started the following Monday. The Riverside project offices were on the ground floor of a building in West Midtown that smelled like new carpet and optimism. James had a desk in the open plan area. Not a corner office, not a partition. A desk with a lamp and a monitor and a window that looked onto a parking structure, which he appreciated for the irony. The first week was mostly listening, which was what first weeks were for, if you did them correctly. Would you treat them with kindness? He sat in the project meetings and said very little and watched how information moved through the room, which was not the same as how it was supposed to move according to the org chart. The org chart said, decisions flowed from Kenneth's office through the project director down to the site teams. What actually happened was that a woman named Donna in logistics held the real schedule in her head, and the project director checked with her before confirming anything, which was efficient and also completely invisible to anyone who hadn't watched long enough to see it. By the end of week 1, James had identified 3 other nodes where the org chart and the actual information flow didn't match. He wrote them down in his notebook. He didn't show anyone. He was still deciding what the information meant. He called Laura every day, sometimes twice. The calls were usually short, 15 minutes in the evening, and consisted primarily of Laura telling him about her design work and him telling her about whatever was mildly absurd about the project office that day, and both of them carefully, not discussing the things that sat underneath the conversation and made it necessary. He told her he'd changed jobs. Into consulting, he said. She'd asked what kind. Construction adjacent, he'd said. She'd accepted this with the specific acceptance of someone who sensed there was more and was choosing, for now, to leave it. Robert knew everything. Robert's response to him with kindness was Pete, knowing everything was to be exactly the same as he'd been before, which was the response James had anticipated, and the response that had made him certain he should tell his father in the first place. Robert asked one question on week 2. How is she holding up? The pressure she's under. She holds it well. That's not the same as it not being heavy. James didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't give one. His father nodded at the space where an answer might have been and let it go. The first joint appearance was a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the courthouse. A charity benefit at a venue in Midtown. The kind of event where the lighting was specifically designed to make everyone feel more important than they probably were, and the minimum donation was 3 times James's monthly rent in Decatur. He wore the gray suit again. He was going to need another suit. He noted this fact without resentment. Facts were facts. Sarah met him in the lobby. She was in a dark green dress that caught the light in a way that was doing its job very effectively. And James thought, not for the first time, would you treat them with kindness? That the women of the Russell family had apparently made a genetic commitment to a certain quality of presence as that made a room recalibrate slightly when they entered it. You're going to have to talk to people, she said in the lobby. Before they went in, I've been talking to people my whole life. I mean people who are going to ask you very specific questions about how we met and how long we've been together and what you do. And we say we met at work, which is true. Would you treat them with kindness? We've been together long enough that it felt right, which is also true in the sense that everything about this felt very deliberate and nothing felt casual. And I'm a project consultant on the Riverside development. She looked at him. That's actually better than what I had prepared. What did you have prepared? I was going to say we met through mutual professional connections, which is technically true but sounds like a real estate transaction. It is somewhat a real estate transaction. Don't say that inside. The event was what events like this were, which was a performance of generosity conducted in the key of competition. James had been to exactly 0 events like this before, and found it clarifying in the way that completely foreign environments were clarifying, where you saw the rules clearly because you hadn't learned to be invisible to them yet. Would you treat them with kindness? He stayed close to Sarah without performing closeness. She introduced him to people and he shook hands and answered questions without elaborating more than necessary and watched the room. Eric Cole arrived at 8:15. With a woman James didn't recognize who had the particular bearing of someone accompanying a person to a professional event rather than choosing to be there. Eric spotted them within 4 minutes. He crossed the room in no hurry. This was interesting. The unhurried crossing of a room said something specific about what a person believed about their own leverage. Sarah. Eric's greeting had the warmth of a negotiating position. He turned to James. We haven't been formally introduced. He held out his hand. James shook it. Firm. Brief. James Holt. Eric Cole. I've heard a great deal about you recently. His smile was the practiced kind. Where did you two manage to meet? Sarah's been fairly private the last couple of years. We worked in the same building, James said. Is that right? What did you do there? And here was the thing about this question. Would you treat them with kindness? The thing James had known was coming because he'd thought about it on the bus ride here, and during the 40 minutes he'd stood in the lobby of their building waiting for Sarah, and for the last 15 minutes, since Eric walked in the door. The question was designed to make James feel that the answer mattered to the person asking it. And the answer did matter to Eric. But not the way Eric intended it to. Facilities management, James said, steady, unashamed. The specific steadiness of someone who had decided before they walked into the room that their history was their history, and no room full of expensive lighting was going to make it something to manage. Eric's smile stayed exactly where it was. Interesting. And now you're consulting on Riverside? I am. Kenneth Barnes is thorough. He must have seen something specific. He did. A structural issue in the permitting timeline. James looked at Eric with the pleasantness of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. Similar problem to one I ran into a few years back on another project. I had a strong opinion about it then too. The smile finally moved. Just slightly. Just enough. Eric said something polite and moved on, and Sarah said nothing, until they were on the other side of the room with their backs to a window. That was, she said. I know. He knows you know. Yes. Does that concern you? Would you treat them with kindness? James looked across the room to where Eric was now talking to someone from the city planning office, with the easy comfort of a man who believed his position was secure. It tells me what he is, which is useful. The benefit ended at 10:30. They shared a car back to James's stop in the comfortable silence of two people who had spent 3 hours performing a version of themselves for an audience and were tired in the specific way of that particular performance. The car stopped. He gathered his jacket. Then Sarah said, James. He turned. I was proud to introduce you tonight. He started to say something dismissive. She went on before he could. Not because you performed well, because you were the only person in that room who wasn't performing at all. He looked at her for a moment. The car was idling. The street outside was quiet. Get some sleep, he said, and got out. 3 days later, he came home to the apartment and found Robert at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and his father's particular expression of someone who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. "Sit down." James sat. "How's the job?" "Good. Actually good." "And how's the other thing?" James knew what the other thing meant. Complicated in the way things get complicated when they're not what you thought they were going to be. What did you think it was going to be? A transaction. Clear on both sides. A problem that money solved. Robert looked at his tea. "And what is it now?" James didn't answer immediately. The refrigerator hummed. Down the street, someone was backing a truck out of a driveway. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm paying attention." His father nodded slowly. "That's the right answer. Keep paying attention." The Riverside project found its rhythm. James was spending 3 days a week in the project office and 2 days at the site itself, where the ground had cleared. The preliminary work had started after the state certification came through at week 4, exactly as he'd predicted. The site foreman, a man named Brian Thompson, who'd been building things in Atlanta for 26 years, shook James's hand the first time they met with the specific grip of someone assessing whether the person across from them had ever done actual work. James apparently passed, because by week 2, Brian was calling him over to look at things and ask questions with the directness of someone who wanted a real answer rather than a consultant's answer, which were, in Brian's evident experience, frequently different things. On a Thursday afternoon, standing on the site with the October chill giving way finally to November cold, Brian pointed out a section of the sub-base preparation that wasn't sitting right. "What do you see?" Brian asked. James crouched down, looked at the compaction pattern, at the way the edges met the existing grade. "Settlement risk. Southeast corner. The compaction's uneven here. You're going to get differential movement under load if you don't address it now." Brian looked at him. "That's what I see too. Project director says it's within tolerance. Get a second compaction test at this corner specifically. Don't send it to the same lab." Brian's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You know, you remind me of a guy I worked with 15 years ago. Caught a foundation issue that 3 engineers had signed off on. What happened? They fixed the foundation and 3 engineers had a very uncomfortable conversation with their licensing board." Brian stood up. "I'll get the test." The test came back the following Monday. The corner was outside tolerance. The project director had a conversation with the geotechnical engineer. The geotechnical engineer had a conversation with Kenneth Barnes. Kenneth called James directly. "You're worth twice what I'm paying you. Add it to the contract next phase." Done. Sarah knew about it by Tuesday. She called him in the evening, which was unusual. Their communication rolled into a pattern that was more structured than friendly but less transactional than contractual, which was its own strange territory. "Kenneth told me about the compaction issue. He shouldn't have. He called me to tell me about you, not about the project. There's a distinction." James was sitting on the sofa in Decatur with a project file on his knee. The lamp made a circle the same way Robert's reading lamp did, and he hadn't noticed until just now that he'd positioned it the same way. "How was your day?" he asked. Not as a deflection, as an actual question. A pause. She wasn't expecting it. Long. "There's a zoning appeal on a property in Cobb County that Eric's been contesting for 3 years. The appeal board moved up their review date and I spent most of today preparing documentation. Will you win?" "Yes, but it'll take until spring and it's going to be expensive. And Eric knows both of those things. He's running down the clock. He's very good at running down the clock." James thought about this, about Eric at the benefit, unhurried across the room. Patient. The specific patience of someone who believed time was on their side because they had more resources to spend it with. "He sent me a text the night of the wedding," James said. The line went quiet. "Offering you money. To walk away. Double your offer. How much did that tell you?" "Everything I needed to know." Another pause. "Different kind. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I handled it. And because telling you that night would have made the conversation about his leverage instead of about what we were actually doing. Which was starting something. I wasn't sure what. But starting something felt like the right frame for that night, not defending against Eric. The line held quiet for a moment that went on long enough to become something. James. Her voice had shifted. Not less professional. More present. The version of her he'd only seen in pieces. At the diner near the hospital and in the courthouse lobby and once in the elevator when she hadn't seen him get in and he'd watched her face do something unguarded for 4 floors. Have you ever thought that this is? She stopped. He waited. I was going to say something that I'm not sure I should say. Then don't say it yet. Right. A breath. Okay. Good night, Sarah. Good night. He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a while. Thought about the things she hadn't said. Thought about whether he knew what it was. Thought about whether knowing what it was and not saying it back was either honest or wise. Decided it was probably both, and that those two things didn't always solve each other. The next morning he got a call from Laura's hospital. Not from Laura. From the billing coordinator. A woman named Donna, whose voice had the particular texture of someone who delivered complicated news several times a day, and had learned to do it with compressed kindness. The $40,000 figure had changed. A federal program had come through with a partial allocation. The remaining gap was now $28,000, which was still $28,000, but it was measurably less impossible than $40,000. He sat in the Riverside project office at his desk with the parking structure view and calculated exactly how long it would take him to pay $28,000 out of the Riverside day rate after his share of the apartment and Robert's medications and the maintenance costs on the situation. 6 months if nothing changed. And things changed. That was the defining characteristic of things. He called Sarah's direct line. Not her cell, the office line, because this was a professional matter. I need to discuss the first payment timeline. The $150,000. It was supposed to clear next week. I know. I need it sooner if possible. There's a medical cost that's time sensitive. No pause. No interrogation. I'll have Thomas process it today. You'll have it by close of business. Thank you. James. He heard her inhale. Is this for Laura? He'd told her enough about Laura for the arrangement to make sense. He hadn't told her details. Yes. Is she okay? She's managing. The transplant list situation has a number on it now that's less impossible. I want to make it more impossible for the number to be a problem. I understand. A beat. Is there anything else? There were several other things. None of them were financial. No. Thank you. Tell her I hope she's well. She doesn't have to know it's from me. He held the phone for a moment after she hung up. The project office was busy around him. Brian Thompson was on the phone 2 desks over. Paul in logistics was walking someone through a delivery schedule. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about a woman at a desk on the 23rd floor of a glass tower who had just redirected $150,000 in 45 seconds without making him explain himself, and had then asked about a woman she'd never met and had offered the kind of message that expected nothing in return. He thought about the things she hadn't said on the phone last night. He thought it was probably time to be honest with himself about what he already knew. The hospital transferred the gap-closing funds the following week. Laura moved up the priority list. Her next clinic appointment showed improved markers, which the transplant coordinator described as encouraging, which, in medical language, meant genuinely good, and they were being careful not to oversell it. James took the word encouraging and put it in the column of things he was allowed to hold on to, he told Robert. Robert sat with it for a moment, and then said, "How did you manage that?" And James said he'd had some help, and Robert looked at him with the particular eyes of still water look that meant he already knew most of the answer, and was asking to see what James would say. "Sarah," James said. Robert nodded. "Good. She didn't have to do it the way she did it. How did she do it? Without making me explain or qualify or justify. She just did it." Robert looked at his hands. The tremor was mild today. "That's worth something," he said. "That's not a small thing to do for someone." "I know. Does she know you know?" "I think so. We don't talk about it directly. Maybe you should." James thought about this for a long time, which in the context of his life meant he thought about it on the bus to the site on Thursday, and in the lift on the way to the 23rd floor on Friday when he had a project meeting with Sarah's team, and through the meeting itself. which was about zoning variance applications, and not about any of this, but which required him to sit across a conference table from her for 90 minutes and notice how she ran a room. Would you treat them with kindness? Which she did with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to lead by first being very precise about what she needed from each person in front of her. He was thinking about it on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later, a cold November day, standing in the 22nd floor corridor outside the secondary conference rooms while a heating duct was being serviced and the whole floor smelled faintly of metal and recycled air, when he heard Eric's voice through a door that had not quite shut. Not on the phone this time. In the room. 2 voices. Eric and someone James didn't recognize. He was walking past. He was not stopping. But sound carried in quiet corridors, and Eric's voice had a carrying quality, the kind trained by years of expecting rooms to hear it. She's going to have to prove it's real. The old man's clause requires documentation of shared commitment, shared finances, shared residence, the whole picture. What we have is a ceremony and a day rate on a construction project. The other voice, lower, so we wait for discovery? We wait for the filing. I have enough to petition the trust for a review. I just need the timing right. Eric paused. The janitor is a problem. He's not what I thought he was. What did you think he was? Manageable. Turns out he's got an opinion about everything, and everyone keeps listening to him. James was past the door, around the corner, moving. He did not slow down. He did not look back, but his mind was doing the rapid, cold calculation of someone who had just confirmed what they suspected and was now running the implications. Review petition. Filing. Discovery. Eric was building a legal case to challenge the marriage's legitimacy. He had the resources to do it. He had Thomas Walsh, or the challenge to Thomas Walsh, or whatever the mechanism was. He had patience, which he demonstrated was his primary weapon, and he'd called James manageable. Past tense, which meant his original assessment had assumed James would behave a certain way, and James hadn't behaved that way, and now Eric was recalibrating. James took the elevator to the 23rd floor. Paul looked up. She's in a call until... It's important! Something in his voice. Paul gestured at the office. James knocked once and went in. Sarah was at her desk with her phone to her ear. She looked at him. Read his face in about 2 seconds. Said into the phone, "Let me call you back in 20 minutes. Yes. Goodbye." And set the phone down. "Tell me," he told her. Exact words, as close as he could reconstruct them. He was good at this. Construction sites required it. The exact sequence mattered, because the sequence was what determined what came next. Sarah listened without touching her phone or her computer. When he finished, she was quiet for 5 seconds. He's filing a trust petition. That's what it sounded like. Thomas needs to know today. She was already reaching for the phone. Then she stopped. Set it back down. Looked at James with the expression of someone who has just made a decision about which problem to address in which order. "Before I call Thomas, I need to tell you something else. Something I should have told you earlier." He sat down. "When I transferred the funds for Laura's treatment gap, I didn't put it through the contract. There's no clause that required it. I moved it as a personal transfer." "I know." Patricia flagged it. "What did you do with the information?" "I filed it in the category of things that meant something and waited to see what else went in the same category." She looked at him directly, steady. And the category is full enough now that I'd rather not pretend it's not full." The office was very quiet. November light came flat through the glass, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything but made everything extremely clear. Sarah said, "I'm not entirely sure this is still a transaction." Quiet, precise. The same voice she used for facts she was certain of. "I'm not entirely sure it has been for a while." James let that sit between them for a moment. "No," he said. "It hasn't." She exhaled. "Just barely. That is either very good or very complicated." "Both," he said. "Usually things worth anything are both." She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached for her phone. "I need to call Thomas." "I know." He stood up, got his jacket, moved toward the door, and stopped Sarah. She was dialing. She looked up. "Whatever Eric files." whatever documentation he thinks he has. What actually happened between your grandfather's clause and right now is that two people started with a transaction and then kept choosing something else. That's not nothing. That's not nothing that any filing can undo. She held the phone. Didn't break the look. No, she said. It isn't. He walked out. The call from Nicole came at 11 that night. He was at the kitchen table with the project files. Robert long since in bed, the apartment settled into its specific nighttime quiet. Eric filed the petition this afternoon, Nicole said. Thomas got the notification an hour ago. Hearing date is set for 5 weeks out. What are they claiming? Contractual marriage. Financial arrangement misrepresented as genuine commitment. They have documentation of the original payment structure. They have a witness statement from someone in the building. We don't know who yet, that you and Sarah maintained separate residences from day one, and... She paused. They have the hospital payment, framed as evidence of financial incentive. James sat very still. They're using Laura's treatment. Eric's attorney is framing it as the primary financial inducement in the arrangement. Evidence that the relationship was transactional in nature. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. 17 steps from end to end. The lamp on the counter. Robert's coffee timer set for tomorrow morning. Does Sarah know? She's the one who asked me to call you. Is she okay? A pause. Nicole had the quality of someone choosing words carefully for once. She's angrier than I've seen her in a long time, which with Sarah means she's very quiet and very focused. Tell her I'll be at her office at 8 tomorrow morning. She said you'd say that. Then tell her she was right. He hung up, sat for a while. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee timer ticked softly in the way of timers set by people who needed to keep doing what they'd always done. He thought about Eric Cole calling him manageable, past tense. He thought about a parking structure in West Midtown with a corrected subframe. He thought about the 4 conditions he'd laid down in a diner near a hospital, and the way Sarah had accepted all of them without negotiation. He thought about a wooden pen made by a man whose hands didn't move the way they used to, pressed into his palm without a word on a Wednesday morning. He thought about what it meant when someone used the thing you'd done out of love to argue that you were incapable of love. He thought about what he was going to do about it. He went to bed at 1 in the morning, lay on the sofa in the dark, set no alarm because he didn't need one. He was going to be at that office at 8. He was going to be there because that was where he needed to be. Not because of a contract or a clause or a transaction or anyone's count of remaining days. Because the person on the 23rd floor was dealing with something she hadn't caused and couldn't fully solve alone, and he knew what to do with that kind of problem. He'd been doing it his whole life, showing up where he was needed, staying until the thing was handled. Except this was different from every other time, because every other time, he'd shown up for someone he already loved, and he was only now admitting to himself that this was not a different situation. He was at her office at 7:58, not 8, because 8 would have been the time he said, and 7:58 was the time he arrived, and the 2 minutes were not an accident. Paul looked up from his desk and nodded without saying anything, which meant Paul had been told to expect him, which meant Sarah had been at her desk long enough this morning to have already had that conversation. He knocked once, went in. She was standing at the window, not sitting. Standing, which was different from how she usually occupied the office. The desk was behind her. Would you treat them with kindness? Atlanta was in front of her, and she was looking at it with the specific quality of someone who needed something larger than themselves to look at while they got their thinking straight. She turned when he came in. She looked like someone who had slept badly and was not going to mention it. Her eyes were clear because she'd decided they would be. Her suit was pressed because of course it was. But there was something underneath the precision that he'd learned to read in the months of watching her work. A thin wire of effort where there was usually solid ground. Nicole told you everything, she said. Yes. Then you know about the hospital payment. Yes. Would you treat them with kindness? She turned back to the window. He's going to stand in front of William Samuels and 7 board members and tell them that the most significant thing you did in this marriage was get your sister paid for. And he's going to use that to argue that you never cared about anything else. James stayed where he was near the door. What does Thomas say about our position? Thomas says we're not as exposed as Eric wants us to feel. But Thomas is also being careful, which means he thinks we're more exposed than he's saying directly. What does Nicole say? A short exhale. Nicole says we need to decide what the truth actually is before we get into that room. Because William Samuels has been reading people for 50 years, and he will know if we're performing. James thought about this. About William Samuels and 50 years of reading rooms. About performance versus the alternative. What do you think the truth is? She didn't answer immediately. The Atlanta skyline did nothing helpful in the window. I think the truth is complicated, she said finally. I think we started as one thing, and somewhere became another thing, and neither of us said so out loud in time. We said the edges of it. We didn't say the whole thing. He crossed the room. Not to her. To the chair across from the desk, which he pulled out and sat in, because standing felt like a conversation that could end. Sitting felt like the other kind. Then let's say the whole thing. She turned from the window, looked at him. Now? 5 weeks is not a long time. She sat down, not behind the desk. Would you treat them with kindness? The one she used when she wasn't running the meeting, which was a choice he registered. I know what I feel, she said. That's not the complicated part. The complicated part is that I don't know if you trust it. Whether you trust that it's real and not a very convincing version of gratitude or relief or something the situation manufactured. Do you think that's what it is? I think I'm the last person to ask. I have reasons to want it to be real. That makes me a biased witness. He looked at her steadily. Then I'll tell you what I see from outside the bias. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, which was how he sat when he meant what he was about to say and needed his whole body to know it. I see a person who corrected herself in real time when she used the word safe in a way that wasn't quite honest. I see a person who drove to Decatur on a Tuesday night, not to manage a situation, but to explain herself badly to someone who deserved the explanation. I see a person who moved money for my sister, without a mechanism and without telling me, not because it was strategic, but because she had the ability, and the problem was in front of her, and so she solved it. He paused. I don't fall in love with transactions. I've been in enough of them to know the difference. The office was very quiet. The kind of quiet that had weight to it. Sarah said, "You just said fall in love." I know what I said. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was processing something she hadn't prepared for, which was one of his favorite things about her, because it was completely unguarded and pure. She didn't seem to know. I started falling somewhere around the night. You told me the 3 failure points in commercial permitting from a standing position in a cafeteria, which is possibly the least romantic origin story in the history of people developing feelings. I started before that. When? In the corridor. When you didn't look through me. She absorbed this, carefully, the way she absorbed everything that mattered. That's a very low bar. It was a very clear signal. She almost smiled. Almost. And then the almost smile became something more complicated, and she looked down at her hands on her knees. Eric is going to make this very difficult. Eric is going to try. James. He has real documentation. The contract exists. The payment structure exists. The separate residences exist. He's going to walk into that room with a clean narrative. So will we. Our narrative includes admitting to a financial arrangement. Our narrative includes admitting to a financial arrangement that became something else. That's not a weakness. That's the actual story. She looked up. You want to tell the truth. I want to tell the whole truth, which is different from what Eric is going to tell, which is a partial truth assembled to look complete. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. He could see her thinking, the way her attention collected itself and went inward, and he waited, because he'd learned that this was what her best decisions looked like from the outside. Quiet, internal, real. Okay, she said. We tell the truth, all of it, including the part where we admit the arrangement was financial at the start, especially that part, because the rest of the story only means something if the start of it is true. Linda Russell arrived 4 days before the hearing. Not announced, not scheduled. She appeared in Sarah's office doorway at 4 in the afternoon, while James was there, reviewing the documentation package with Thomas and Nicole. Would you treat them with kindness? And Sarah looked up and said Mom in the voice of someone who was surprised and then immediately reassessed why they were surprised and concluded they shouldn't have been. Linda Russell was 61 and had the bearing of someone who had navigated considerable difficulty without allowing it to bend her posture. She looked at the room, at Thomas, at Nicole, at James last and for the longest. Give us the room, Sarah said. Thomas and Nicole gathered their files with the efficiency of people who recognized an unmovable object entering their space. The door closed. Linda sat down, not across from Sarah, in the chair closest to James, which was a choice he clocked immediately. I went to Decatur last week, she said. I didn't tell either of you. Sarah, Mom. I went because I wanted to meet Robert Holt, because my daughter was about to walk into a hearing that could affect the next decade of her life, and I wanted to understand who was walking in beside her. James said, What did you think of him? Linda looked at him with clear eyes. I think he's a man who built things for 40 years and watched his hands stop cooperating and decided that what mattered was what he'd passed on rather than what he'd lost. She paused. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about the floor he laid in Harold's first building. He didn't know I was Harold's daughter-in-law when he started the story. When he figured it out, he said, That's a coincidence that means something. And I said, In my experience, the coincidences that mean something usually do. The office was very still. He told me about you, she said to James, about the job you lost, about why you lost it. He shouldn't have needed to tell you. He told me because he wanted me to understand what kind of man his son is before I made any assumptions based on what his son does for work. She folded her hands. I didn't have assumptions, but I appreciated the clarity. She turned to Sarah. You should have told me months ago. I know. Not about the arrangement. You could have kept that from me. I mean, you should have told me that you'd found someone worth keeping. Sarah looked at her mother for a moment with an expression she didn't have very often, which was one stripped of management and presentation. Just a daughter looking at a mother across a problem that was also, underneath, a relief. I wasn't sure yet. Are you sure now? Yes. Linda nodded once, the settled nod of someone who has received the confirmation they came for. She looked at James. Robert said to tell you that the coffee timer is set. Whatever that means. He felt something shift in his chest. Small and specific. It means he's okay. He seemed okay. He also said. She paused. Something that might have been the edge of a smile. He said his son gets the same look on his face when he's working through something important as he did when he was 12 and learning to cook, determined and slightly irritated. That's accurate. He said you'd say that. She stood. I'll be at the hearing. Front row. Eric knows I'll be there and I want him to see me before it starts. She looked between them. Tell the truth. All of it. Harold built that clause because he believed the truth of a thing was worth more than the appearance of it. Eric has spent years being the appearance. Don't play his game. She left without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony. Sarah looked at the door for a moment after it closed. She likes you, she likes Robert. She has good taste in both directions. Sarah looked at her desk, at the documentation, at the 5 weeks of preparation condensed into a stack of paper. I need to call Thomas back in. I know. James. He was already moving toward the door to let Thomas and Nicole back in. After this is over, he stopped. Whatever happens in that room. After it's over, I want to have a conversation that doesn't involve lawyers or documentation or the word clause. So do I, he said, and opened the door. George Owens called on the morning of the hearing, 7 a.m. James was buttoning the gray suit in the bathroom mirror, which had been cleaned recently, which was something Robert had done on a good hands day and not mentioned. 16-letter word, George said, means determination in the face of opposition. James looked at his reflection. Indefatigable. A pause. George counting. That's exactly right. Another pause. You're going to be fine today. How do you know about today? Building talks. Also, I'm a security guard. We know everything. George's voice shifted slightly. The crossword voice versus the other one. You're a good man, James. You were a good man when you were here every morning at 5:15, and you're a good man now. Don't let anyone in that room make you forget what you are. He stood in the bathroom with the phone against his ear. The suit jacket was on. His father's pen was in the inside breast pocket, because he'd put it there without thinking, and then thought about it and decided to leave it. Thanks, George. Go on then. The Russell Holdings conference room on the 38th floor had a different quality at full occupancy than it did empty. James had cleaned it twice a week for nearly 2 years. He knew every corner of it. The vent that rattled faintly when the building's HVAC shifted modes. The chair at the far left of the board table that sat half an inch lower than the others because a wheel had been replaced with a slightly shorter model, and nobody had corrected it. He knew the room. The room did not know him, which had once been the entire point and was now something he was choosing to change. 7 board members. William Samuels at the head, 70 years old, white-haired, the specific kind of stillness that came from having seen enough, that very little was surprising anymore. Eric on the left side of the table with his attorney, a man named Gerald Park, who had the compact precision of someone who charged by a number with many digits. Thomas and Nicole on the right with Sarah and James. Linda in the front row of observer chairs. Robert beside her, in his suit, having taken a taxi from Decatur, which James had not arranged and had not been asked about. Kenneth Barnes 3 chairs down. Brian Thompson's, who had no reason to be here except that James had mentioned the hearing date once on a sidewalk, and Brian had apparently written it down. Eric looked at the observer chairs. Looked at Robert. Something in his face recalculated. William Samuels called the room to order with the particular economy of someone who understood that ceremony existed to move things forward, not to fill time. Eric's attorney Gerald spoke first. Organized. Precise. The contract. The payment structure. The timeline. The separate residences. The hospital transfer that Gerald framed, carefully and repeatedly, as the material inducement of the arrangement. He had documents for each point. He had them tabbed. He presented them without drama, because the drama in his assessment was in the documents themselves. James watched the board members as Gerald spoke, watched which ones were taking notes, which ones were looking at the documents, which ones were looking at the documents and which were looking at the people. William Samuels was looking at the people, had been since the beginning. His eyes moved between Eric, Sarah, and James, with the slow, regular sweep of someone running a very long calculation. Thomas responded to the documents. Factual. Thorough. He did not attempt to reframe the contract's existence. He acknowledged it with kindness. He acknowledged it as it was and then laid beside it everything else that was also true, which took considerably longer and had fewer tabs because the truth of how things developed was harder to tabulate than the truth of how they started. Then Samuels looked at Sarah. Mrs. Holt, the board would like to hear from you directly. She was prepared. James had watched her prepare. Would you treat them with kindness? But preparation and the moment of it were different things, and he saw, in the half-second before she began speaking, the thin wire of effort that meant she was choosing honesty over performance, and that the choosing cost her something. Yes, she said. I offered James Holt a financial arrangement. The terms are exactly as presented. I needed to satisfy my grandfather's clause, and I had 89 days, and I made an offer that was, at its origin, a transaction. She paused. Let it sit. Did not rush past it. I'm not going to qualify that. It was what it was. Gerald made a small movement. The movement of a man whose opponent just agreed with his central argument. Sarah went on. What I will tell the board is that what followed was not a transaction. I transferred funds to address a medical situation for James's sister, not because any clause required it, but because I was aware of the problem and had the means to help, and I didn't want to make him ask. I drove to his neighborhood on a weeknight to explain myself badly, because the situation required honesty, and honesty required showing up in person. I met his father before a wedding ceremony because his father's opinion mattered to James, and therefore it mattered to me. Would you treat them with kindness? None of those things were in the contract. None of them were strategic. They were what happened when I stopped thinking about 89 days and started thinking about the person I'd asked to spend them with. The room was quiet. Harold Russell wrote that clause, she said, because he believed that the people who ran this company should understand what it meant to build something with someone. To show up. To stay past the point when staying was easy. I don't believe he wrote it to be satisfied by paperwork. She looked at William Samuels directly. I believe he wrote it because he knew the difference between people who constructed the appearance of commitment and people who built the actual thing. I'm asking this board to see the difference. Samuels looked at James. Mr. Holt. James had no notes. He hadn't written any. The things worth saying didn't need notes. I agreed to this arrangement because my sister needed money that I couldn't get any other way fast enough. He let that sentence stand alone. Didn't apologize for it. Didn't soften it. That's the truth. I'm not going to dress it up because this room has expensive furniture. Someone in the observer section made a sound. He didn't look. What I'll tell you is what happened after. I told my father everything before I agreed. Not a version of it. Everything. Would you treat them with kindness? Because I don't make decisions that affect his life without his knowledge, which is a principle I hold regardless of the amount of money involved. I met with an independent attorney who represented my interests before I signed a single document. I set 4 conditions before I agreed, and every one of them was about protecting the people I'm responsible for. He paused. None of that is the behavior of someone who was managing a transaction. That's the behavior of someone who was trying to do a complicated thing with integrity. Gerald stirred. The board should note that this is precisely the framing. I'm not finished, James said. Not sharply. Evenly. The specific evenness of someone who has been interrupted in professional settings before and has decided that stopping is not the right response. Gerald stopped. My sister's treatment gap was real. The money addressed it. If Eric Cole wants to argue that helping someone's sick sibling is evidence of transactional thinking, I'll let the board draw their own conclusions about what that argument says. He looked at William Samuels. Harold Russell shook my father's hand at a job site in 1971. My father ran a floor sander for him on the second building Russell Holdings ever owned. He got paid what he was owed, on time, and Harold stayed to shake every hand before he left. He paused. I didn't know that when Sarah made her offer. My father told me after. He said people tend to come from the ones who raised them more than from the ones who just gave them money. I've spent 5 months finding out whether he was right. He stopped. Let the room do what rooms did with things that had just been said. He was right. Samuels made no visible response to this. His face was the face of someone at the end of a very long calculation who was reviewing the result one more time before committing to it. Gerald was already on his feet. The board should note that sentiment is not documentation. The clause requires Nicole's voice, clear and without hesitation. The board should also note this. She placed a document on the table. Not dramatically. The way you placed something down when you knew it was enough. An internal communication from Eric Cole to his legal team, dated 3 days after the marriage certificate was filed, in which Mr. Cole offered James Holt double the initial financial arrangement to withdraw from the marriage. Quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room observing procedure. The other kind. If the marriage was transparently contractual, Nicole said. If it was, as Mr. Cole's team has argued, obviously not a genuine commitment then, why did Eric Cole spend money trying to end it? Gerald's mouth opened. A man who believes his opponent's position is legally indefensible does not offer them $2 million to change their mind. Nicole looked at the board. He does that because he's afraid. And what he's afraid of is exactly what this board is being asked to consider. Eric's jaw was set. The careful pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was a man who had miscalculated, which happened to people who spent long enough being patient that they mistook patience for advantage. Samuels looked at Eric. Mr. Cole, you'd like to respond? Eric looked at Gerald. Gerald said quietly, I'd recommend we take the recess option, William. Samuels's expression did not change. The board will take 20 minutes. The hallway outside the conference room was the same hallway James had cleaned for 2 years. Same carpet. Same frosted glass panels with the afternoon light coming flat through them. Different day. Different version of him standing in it. Robert and Linda were already in the hall when James came out. They were standing near the window at the corridor's end, still talking, and they had the quality of people who had been put next to each other by circumstance and had found, unexpectedly, that they fit. Sarah came out behind James. She stood beside him. Down the hall, Robert said something James couldn't hear. Linda laughed. An actual laugh. The surprised kind. "They're going to be fine in there," Sarah said quietly. "Not about the board. About Robert and Linda." "I know, James." She was looking at the window at Atlanta below in the November gray. "Whatever they decide. I want you to know that the 5 months between that corridor on the 24th floor and this hallway are not something I would trade to have avoided any of this." He looked at her profile, the specific quality of her in this light, which was not flattering light, which was exactly why it told the truth about her, in a way that the lobby photographs never did. Neither would I. Even the parts that were difficult. Especially those. She turned to look at him. Why especially? He thought about how to say it accurately. Because the difficult parts are when you find out what something's actually made of. Easy doesn't tell you anything. She held his look for a moment. A long one. The kind that had weight and shape, and that both of them understood was something they were going to have to talk about properly, at length, without lawyers. "After," she said. "After," he agreed. Kenneth Barnes appeared from the direction of the observer room, coffee in hand, unhurried. He stopped when he saw them, looked between them, made no comment, said only, "You both did well in there," and kept walking toward the window where Robert and Linda were still talking. Brian Thompson materialized from somewhere, as he did on job sites, from a direction that made no particular sense. He stopped beside James, looked at the door. 7-person panel, Brian said. "How long does 7 people take to agree on something?" "Depends on whether they already agree." "Do they?" James thought about Samuels's face during the testimony, the steady, unhurried sweep of it. "I think so." Then 10 minutes. It was 14. Samuels opened the door himself. "We're ready." The board had not rearranged. Samuels at the head. 6 members on either side. Eric and Gerald Rind returned to the seats with the particular quality of people who had used the recess to make private calculation and arrived at a number they didn't like. "The board has reviewed the documentation and testimony," Samuel said. "Before I give the finding, I want to say something about the nature of what we were asked to evaluate." Gerald shifted. Samuels continued without looking at him. "Harold Russell wrote them with kindness." Harold Russell wrote the clause in question because he understood something that people who inherit things sometimes don't, which is that what you build with someone tells you more about what you're capable of than what you inherit from them. He looked at the documents on the table without picking them up. "Would you treat them with kindness?" "We were presented with evidence of a financial arrangement. We were also presented with evidence of what happened after the financial arrangement began. The board does not find those two things to be in conflict. A commitment that begins in difficult circumstances and survives them is, in this board's view, precisely the kind of commitment Harold Russell was trying to require." Eric's hands on the table were very still. "The petition filed by Eric Cole is denied. The marriage between Sarah Russell and James Holt satisfies the conditions of Harold Russell's estate clause in both letter and spirit. The board considers this matter closed." Gerald began to speak. Samuels looked at him once, and Gerald closed his mouth, which told James a great deal about the 50 years of reading rooms. Eric stood. His face had the quality of someone conducting a rapid internal revision. He looked at Sarah. "Not James. Sarah. This isn't finished." Sarah looked at him evenly. "Eric, go home." He left. Gerald followed. The sound of the door was the sound of a calculation that had been running for 8 months, reaching its final number and coming out wrong. The room exhaled. Kenneth Barnes said, from the back, "Thank God. Now can we talk about the Phase 2 permitting on Riverside?" Brian Thompson laughed. It was a large laugh for a large man, and it broke something in the room's formality that needed breaking. Thomas was shaking James's hand. Nicole was already on her phone. Linda had crossed from the observers section and was standing beside Sarah, with her hand on her daughter's arm. in the way of mothers who have been worried and are allowing themselves, finally, to stop. Robert was still at the window at the end of the hall. James went to him. His father was looking at the Atlanta skyline, the gray November light, the city going about its Wednesday. "How did it go?" Robert asked. He hadn't come back into the room, had waited here by the window. "It went well." Robert nodded. Not surprised, just confirmation. "Good, you didn't come in, I was already there, in your testimony." He looked at James with the still water eyes. "Did you say what you needed to say?" "I said what was true." "Same thing." They stood together for a moment. The city below, the hallway behind them filling with the sound of people finishing the last of a difficulty. Linda's voice. Thomas's measured tones. Kenneth's already pivoting to the next problem. "Dad." Robert waited, the coffee timer every morning. "I've been meaning to say." His father looked at him. "Don't. I set the coffee timer because I've set the coffee timer every night for 30 years and I intend to set it for 30 more. Quiet. Final. The particular firmness of someone who has decided what their hands will do, regardless of what they can't control. It's not for you. It's for me." James looked at his father. "I know." "Good." A hand on James's shoulder. Brief. Sufficient. The kind of contact that meant everything it needed to mean and nothing more. He turned back to the room. Sarah was standing in the conference room doorway looking at him. The door opened behind her. The room beginning to empty. She looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy and was noticing, with mild surprise, that she still knew how to stand straight without it. He crossed the hallway to her. "Come on," he said. "I promised you a conversation without lawyers. There are still lawyers in the room. Then let's go somewhere there aren't." She considered this. Would you treat them with kindness? And then she did something he'd seen her do exactly twice before, in the diner near the hospital and once in the elevator when she didn't know he was watching. Her face let go of the managing and the precision and the 89 days and all the other things she'd been holding together got by considerable effort. And what was underneath it was someone considerably lighter and slightly uncertain and fully present. "Okay," she said. "Lead the way." They took the stairs. Not because the elevator was broken. Because sometimes you take the stairs to get there the long way, and it's the right choice. The lobby of Russell Holdings in November late afternoon had the golden quality of light that came when the sun was low and the glass of the building caught it correctly. James had come through this lobby hundreds of times in a Navy uniform, with a visitor badge and a cart and his eyes on the job. He came through it now in the gray suit, with his father's pen in his breast pocket and Sarah Russell beside him. The lobby security desk was George's station, though George was on days and would be gone by now. But the new guy at the desk looked up and then looked again, and James had the brief internal acknowledgement that the building was recalibrating again, deciding which drawer he went in. He didn't mind. He'd wait. Outside, the city was cold and clear and going about its evening. They walked without direction for a block and then Sarah said, "There's a place on 5th. Coffee. Not the kind that costs more than your grocery run." You remembered that. I remember most things you say. It's a problem I've decided to stop treating as one. They walked to the place on 5th. It was small and warm and smelled like something roasting. And the person behind the counter knew Sarah by name and looked at James with the frank curiosity of someone who had watched Sarah Russell come in alone for 3 years and was now making rapid reassessments. They took the corner table. 2 coffees. No food. The city outside the window was darkening into itself. He told her about George's phone call this morning. The 16-letter word. Would you treat them with kindness? She listened, her coffee cup in both hands, and her eyes on him, the full attention that he'd catalogued as rare on that first day, and now understood was simply what she gave to things that mattered. She told him about Linda's visit to Decatur, that she'd found out 2 days after the fact, and hadn't said anything, because she was still processing what it meant that her mother had taken a taxi to a neighborhood she'd never been to, and sat for 2 hours with a man she'd never met, and come back with the word keep. She said, "Keep?" James asked. She said, "That's a family worth keeping close." Sarah looked at the window. "She hasn't said anything like that since my father died." He held that for a moment, the weight of what it meant for Linda Russell to say something like that. The weight of what it meant that Robert had sat there for 2 hours, and apparently earned it. "My father set the coffee timer this morning," he said. "He told me not to make it mean anything. But it means something." She looked at him. "What does it mean? That he's okay? That he's decided to be okay?" He looked at his coffee. "He's been deciding that every morning for 6 years, and I don't know if I've said so. You should say so." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went by. The specific sound of Atlanta's transit system that he'd ridden so many times in so many directions, and that still, for some reason, made him feel like the city was doing something with intent. "What happens now?" she asked. "Not about Eric, not about the clause. The other what?" "We figure it out," he said. "Properly. Without 89 days and without Gerald Park and without the word clause. That's going to require some adjustment. I've made adjustments before. So have I." She looked at him across the table, the direct look, the one she used for things she was certain of. "I'm good at adjustments. I know. I want to meet Laura," she said. "Not as a concept, as a person. If she's willing, she'll want to evaluate you herself. She's going to ask you several pointed questions and not soften the delivery." "Good. I'd respect that. She's going to like you." "How do you know?" "Because you don't look through people." He said it simply, the same way he'd said it in the courthouse lobby, the same truth arriving at a new distance. "She'll notice. She notices everything." Sarah's expression did the thing again. The unguarded version of her, present and slightly uncertain and not managing anything. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without deflecting." He waited. "You are the most honest person I've sat across a table from in a decade of running a company full of people who believe honesty is a negotiating position." She held his look. "I want to keep sitting across tables with you. Professionally. Otherwise. All the versions. I want." She stopped, made a brief, impatient movement. "I want to stop finding reasons to qualify what I actually mean." "Then don't." "I mean that I love you," she said. Direct, unqualified. The same voice she used for things she'd checked twice and was certain of. "That's what I mean." The coffee shop was warm. The city was dark outside. Somewhere in Decatur, Robert Holt was setting a coffee timer for the morning, with whatever steadiness his hands offered him today. James said, "I know." And then, because knowing and saying were different things, and he'd decided in a courthouse hallway to stop treating them as interchangeable, "I love you too. I've known for long enough that I should have said it sooner." She exhaled, small, real, the sound of something being put down. Okay. She picked up her coffee. "The Riverside Phase 2 kickoff is next Thursday. I know Kenneth called me yesterday. Brian wants you on site for the subframe inspection. I told him Tuesday." "Right." She was looking at her cup, the edge of something that was going to become a smile. "So you're staying." "I was always staying." The smile arrived. Not the practiced public version. The real one, smaller and less certain and considerably more convincing. Outside the window, Atlanta moved through its evening. Bus routes and building lights and the specific grid of a city going about its necessary business. Somewhere in the building 3 blocks east, the 38th floor conference room was empty again. Returning to the thing it was every other day of the year. Just a room with a window and a table and chairs, one of which sat half an inch lower than the rest. James put his father's pen on the table between them. She looked at it. "He gave it to me the morning of the courthouse," James said, without saying why. "I've been carrying it since." He looked at the pen. "He set the coffee timer this morning." She reached out and picked up the pen, held it the way she'd held it the first time, in the clerk's office with the dry fountain pen and the forms that needed signing. Carefully, with both hands. Like something that belonged to a category she understood. She set it down between them again. "Tell him thank you," she said. "I will. Tell him the coffee timer matters. He'll say it doesn't. Tell him anyway." He would. Tomorrow morning, after the timer went off and the coffee finished, and Robert came out of his room in the slow, careful way of a man who had decided to keep doing what he'd always done, he would tell him. Not to make it heavy, just to say it. Would you treat them with kindness? Because the difference between knowing and saying was the difference between carrying something alone and sharing the weight of it, and he'd been learning. across 5 months and one gray suit and a pen made of worn wood, that the second way was better. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The city outside was fully dark now. Atlanta doing what cities did after the workday let go, settling into its own particular nighttime hum. They stayed for another hour, talking about nothing that required lawyers, everything that required honesty. The version of a conversation that couldn't be scheduled, couldn't be prepared for, couldn't be anything other than two people sitting in the same light deciding, without documentation, to keep choosing each other, which was, in the end, the only clause that had ever mattered.